Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Iverson, the Michael J. Fox Foundation's contributing editor and your moderator today. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we take up the topic of wearable devices and how they may change the landscape, both for Parkinson's patients and Parkinson's researchers. Today's webinar is part of our regular Third Thursday webinar series. You can log on every third Thursday of the month at 12 Eastern Time, 9 Pacific. That would be 10 in Mountain Time, 11 in Central. And you can ask questions about a topic of importance to the Parkinson's community. We hope you'll mark your calendars and join us throughout the year. Just a couple of other quick notes before we get started. First, we'd like to acknowledge AstraZeneca for their sponsorship of the 2014 Third Thursday webinars. Also, we want to remind you that you can submit your questions throughout the presentation today. So you'll see a little Q&A box in the right corner of your screen. So you can just type in your questions there, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can. And then last, we also want to mention that the slides that we're using today are available for you to download. So you'll see a box called Resource List on the right, and you can click on that document you see there and download the slides should you care to do so. So let's get started. Here are the topics that we're going to cover today. Recently, the Michael J. Fox Foundation and Intel launched a new research project to try to figure out what sort of ways in which wearable devices could be useful both for Parkinson's patients and Parkinson's researchers. And so what we're trying to learn in this study is what sort of Parkinson's features or symptoms can be detected through wearable monitors. How can these devices help with patient care? How can they help research move faster, importantly? And how can all of these big new big data technologies, what can they teach researchers about Parkinson's disease? So that's what we're trying to find out in this new study that the Fox Foundation partnered with Intel about, and that's going to be the focus of what we cover today. Joining us to do that are our panelists, Brett Parker, who is an attorney in New York City and also a member of the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Brett was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2007, serves with me on the Michael J. Fox Foundation's Patient Council, and as you can see by the photo there, Brett takes a relatively assertive approach to dealing with Parkinson's. Brett, good morning.
Good morning, Dave, and good afternoon, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks for being part of our conversation. We will hear more from Brett. He was part of this initial Fox Intel study, and we're going to hear about his experience in just a moment. Joining us as well is Lilly Cappelletti, who is the Associate Director of Research Partnerships at the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Lilly, good morning and good afternoon.
Good morning, good afternoon, and I'm happy to be here.
And finally, Dr. William Marks. Dr. Marks is a movement disorder specialist and professor of neurology at the University of California, San Francisco, and is serving as a consultant to the Fox Foundation and Intel in this overall project. Bill Marks, good morning as well.
Hello, everyone.
So let's begin, Bill Marks and Lilly Cappelletti, by talking just a little bit more about these devices. We see on the screen these wearable sensors, various kinds of smartphone applications. I think we're all kind of generally aware that these devices can tell us a lot about what's going on with us at any particular time. But Lilly Cappelletti, just give us a sort of quick snapshot, if you would, of how these devices are actually able to monitor what they monitor and the kinds of things that they can do. And then, Bill, I'll turn to you to fill in what the applicability for Parkinson's. But Lilly first, give us a quick snapshot of what the devices do.
Sure. So wearable devices, as many people probably know, can be used to monitor a whole bunch of different aspects of life. There are, many different devices out there with all different kinds of sensors to track things like motion and activity, autonomic functions such as blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, and also sleep patterns. But the foundation and the initiative that we're talking about today in our partnership with Intel is using a couple of specific smartwatch devices coupled with a smartphone application, which you'll learn more about, that specifically focus on tracking motor function. And they use raw accelerometer data as well as gyroscope data to tell us something about the individual wearing the device and how they're moving, which Bill will get into much more as how it relates to Parkinson's disease, but you can imagine that with a movement disorder such as Parkinson's disease, which does have many motor symptoms, these devices are helpful in tracking motion specifically.
So Bill Marks, take us now into more of the Parkinson's applicability. Lilly was mentioning that because they monitor movement, and Parkinson's, of course, at least in part, is a movement disorder, you can pretty readily imagine how that would apply. But what symptoms of Parkinson's are these devices actually able to monitor?
Well, that's exactly right. The beauty of these devices is that one can monitor normal movement and assess for what we would expect to be normal movement. In other words, how quickly is one walking, how readily is one using the hands, the speed, the amplitude, the amount of movement. And certainly for persons of a particular age, we would expect a certain speed of movement and a certain level of activity. And so just being able to assess the type of movement that a person with Parkinson's is able to demonstrate can be very useful. But then furthermore, because Parkinson's can produce abnormal movements, these devices can also detect those. So what I'm talking about would be, of course, tremor, as well as dyskinesia or dystonia. So all of these sorts of facets of movement could be detectable by these various devices. And then, as Lilly mentioned, beyond movement, the devices presently have some capability to monitor other functions like vital signs and automatic functions, perspiration, temperature, heart rate, and also have algorithms for sleep analysis. So all of those sorts of capabilities really are quite relevant to Parkinson's.
So we see at the bottom of the slide, Bill, that this important point, which anyone living with Parkinson's, of course, knows, that it's a 24/7 condition. And so is the primary value then that this gives us is that it, as it says in bold print below, that this gives us a snapshot, more than a snapshot in a way, of someone's entire day, someone's entire life with Parkinson's, which of course it would seem like could yield much more data than what you would get when someone just walks in for their, every 6-month visit with Bill Marks' clinician.
Well, that's absolutely right, and it is one of the key advantages of these wearable sensors is that when a patient comes into the clinic, we're seeing a very brief snapshot of their function. Oftentimes patients will have taken their medication, they're functioning at their best, and what we're not able to discern is really the full picture of their function. And since these devices can be available to monitor movement and other functions 24 hours a day automatically, this will give us a much clearer idea of what the real-world function, so to speak, of everyone is. In addition to the sort of round-the-clock capabilities, these sensors are also collecting objective data. So rather than a person having to think back and rely on their memory as to how they're doing at a particular time of the day, we've got objective data that's being collected automatically round the clock. And then furthermore, because we could be doing this over the course of a long period of time, one can see trends over time on a day-to-day basis, week to week, month to month, year to year. And then I think another advantage is really empowering patients because conceivably they would be able to take a look at their own data and really understand themselves how they're functioning.
And would that then also mean that a patient then might be in the position of saying, I've been noticing, according to the data that I'm collecting, that my arm isn't swinging as much, Dr. Marks.
Absolutely. And yeah, Dave, I mean, clinicians love this when patients are great observers and they bring in the data for us. Now, presently, that data typically consists of handwritten notes or a diary or, notes that have been logged into their smartphone. But here we would really begin to see a more robust data set, objectively acquired over the long term, And I just think this makes for an amazing partnership between the patient and the clinician to work together to really understand what the data are telling us. And importantly then, how does that translate into a potential adjustment of therapy, medication, or what have you?
We're going to turn to how this applies to research in just a moment, and then after that we'll hear from Brett Parker about his own experience. But Lilly Cappelletti, I mean, how these devices are able, as I understand it, to capture as much as 300 data points a second. So, if you do the math, which I haven't, you're talking about an extraordinary amount of data. How does all this get reduced, I guess, to some sort of digestible form, either for the patient or for the clinician?
Well, that's really the million-dollar question, and the reason that the Michael J. Fox Foundation is so fortunate to be partnering with Intel here, because the piece that the foundation brings to this is our access to the patient and caregiver community and the ability to get these devices out into the hands of large numbers of people to collect large amounts of data. And you're correct, they can collect up to 300 data points per second per patient. But what Intel adds here is an extra layer. So in addition to them kind of hosting all of this data, which is a huge task in and of itself, there are data scientists on the Intel side who are helping to take all of this objective data and develop algorithms that will help to distill these huge, vast data points down into meaningful outcomes for patients and for researchers. So these scientists are trying to help determine by looking at this data what for example, what tremor would look like in the accelerometer data that comes in from the smartwatch and the smartphone, how to objectively say that this person is experiencing rigidity at this moment in time. And the computer algorithms that are being generated are designed to do that. And what Fox will eventually do is help to get this digestible information back into the hands of the patients and participants who are using these tools. So we'll develop a way to share the information that's most pertinent and relevant and sort of already analyzed back to the individual who's using the device.
This is Bill.
I just want to, as you chime in, Bill, reference, if you would, how long it'll take to figure all that out, because it sounds like right now we've got lots of data, but we don't necessarily know how to interpret that data.
Well, and that's exactly the point I was going to make, and I think that is both the challenge and opportunity of so-called big data approaches. The challenge is that we are collecting an enormous amount of data for each individual person and then multiply that by hundreds or thousands or 10,000s of patients. So there's all this enormous data, and the question is, where do you detect a meaningful signal within it? In other words, a signal perhaps to indicate function that's relevant to adjust a medication, a signal that's relevant to indicate an investigational therapy is slowing the course of the disease, for example. And as Lilly said, this is the power of big data and the tools. And of course, this approach is being used throughout medicine and many other areas and across many other sectors to analyze financial data, security data, et cetera. And so this is not that unique to the world of medicine. But as you allude to, this is really in the early stages. And what we're trying to do now is to collect these data sets, correlate them with clinically meaningful information for Parkinson's patients, and then begin to extract the meaningful signals buried in all of this noise.
Let's come back and talk further about, how soon we'll get to that point where this will actually be useful data, both for the clinician and the patient. But I want to push us ahead, if I might, to how this can also apply in time once we understand how to take this data and have it yield usable information. How it might also apply to research. We can see how it could apply to patient life if I actually know objectively that I'm having more problems with a tremor or arm swing or whatever, and how that could be useful to the clinician. But what's also so central to this that I think has so much promise is in terms of research. So Bill Marks, in terms of research, how can this make a difference to, if we're testing, let's say, a new drug, and we want to find out whether or not that's actually slowing down the progress of Parkinson's disease, how will this sort of data be an improvement over how we currently are able to make those determinations?
Well, let's take a look how we currently make those determinations in contrast. So presently for most studies, there's some sort of in-person neurological examination, maybe some time motor tests, and perhaps some questionnaires that a patient and their caregiver may complete about their function, their quality of life, maybe a diary about their on-time, off-time dyskinesia. These are all pretty coarse measures, fairly subjective, require, an in-person evaluation, and are made fairly infrequently. And so because of the variability, it is difficult oftentimes to detect a meaningful change to alert us that an investigational intervention is actually working, whatever working is. It might be improving symptoms, slowing the disease, what have you. Now imagine with sensors acquiring data 24 hours a day in an objective manner, now we can acquire a huge data set. We should be able to detect smaller changes that occur over shorter periods of time. So I think what this means is this should accelerate the speed with which we can detect meaningful changes from a therapy, and therefore we can really say we need to pursue something and not abandon it, or gosh, we're not seeing a signal, let's move on to a different approach. So accelerate the pace of detecting these meaningful changes. And also, I think importantly from the standpoint of disease-modifying therapies that could decelerate Parkinson's progression, which is of course what we're all after, or stabilize Parkinson's, having a large data set is extremely important in detecting these subtle changes. And then just the practicality of this. Patients would not need to be coming into their neurologist's office once a week, once a month, every 3 months. Rather, the data can be collected continuously, can be streamed into a secure server for analysis. Data analytics can take place in real time or near real time rather than waiting for the end of a study 3 years later. So again, I think what this all points to is greater precision of measurements, greater ability to detect a meaningful signal, as it were, and then just accelerating the pace of research.
And I would think, Lilly Cappelletti, from the Michael J. Fox Foundation's point of view, part of what makes this so appealing, in addition to all of the things that Bill was just noting, is that I would think it would make big pharmaceutical companies or others interested in developing potential therapies that much more interested, because they know they have a better yardstick. They know they're not going to have to rely on sort of the crude, we see in the picture on the device on the slide, that someone pointing to pointing to their nose or pointing to manipulating their bodies in different ways. You're going to have much, much more precise information, and that I would think would make big pharmaceutical companies saying, okay, I'm going to invest in developing drugs because now I'm going to have a much better way of knowing whether or not those drugs can actually be successful.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to note that that's going to probably take us quite some time before these measures are, validated to the point that they're able to be used in therapeutic development consistently. But that's our goal, and I also think, another reason that that this technology makes it appealing is that if we were able to objectively measure the impact of therapeutic on a patient through the use of these wearable devices, it could significantly cut down on the amount of time that trials take and the expense involved in conducting clinical trials. Because right now, obviously, we know that a lot of these trials take huge numbers of patients and require tons of travel to and from trial sites for study follow-up and to really subjectively have the investigator look at the participant in this way, as you see on the slide. But if they were able to measure the impact of the therapeutic just by virtually distributing these devices to patients in their own home, it would certainly reduce costs and potentially also speed up the the time that it takes to get a new therapy to market.
So let's find out right now then more about kind of where we are right now. We've heard something about the promise, both for how this could help patients and clinicians do a better job of monitoring what's actually going on with a patient by yielding so much more objective data, and also how this could really speed the research process. But we're a ways from that. So let's find out more about what we're learning about right now with the current state of this research. And again, the Fox Foundation and Intel have partnered on this new data initiative, and the starting point has been to have a small number of patients and controls wear a couple of smartwatches, carry a smartphone to begin figuring out how easy is this to do, what kind of data can it yield, how can we interpret that, how do people respond to it, and what we're going to do now is find out what that experience was like by one of the participants in this pilot trial, and that's Brett Parker. Brett, again, is one of my colleagues on the Michael J. Fox Foundation Patient Council, an attorney in New York, and participated in this first pilot study. Brett, thanks again for being a part of this. Tell us first what you did, what you actually wore, what that experience was like.
Thanks, Dave. So it was an incredibly cool experience. To step back, I learned about it through the Fox Trial Finder. I subscribe to it, and so I get alerts every so often of when there's clinical trials that are occurring near where I live. I've participated in a couple of trials, and then I saw this one about wearables and technology as a way to try to find more treatments and cures, and as a patient to get a little more control over the disease. And so I was fascinated about it even when I first read about it. So what it involved was, as you said, basically I wore two watches for I think it was 3 or 4 days, and a smartphone which would upload the data to the researchers. And I tracked my symptoms and my medication in a log over the same days. And when I turned all of it in, the idea, I guess, is to match up, what did I write and what did I remember and experience, and then what did the data show from these 2 watches and the smartphone that uploaded the data.
And how cumbersome did you find wearing these devices? I think one thing people would be curious about was it just, was it a pain in the neck to have these strapped on?
It's a great question, because I was worried about that as well. The first thing I was mostly worried about was sleeping with a watch. As all patients who have Parkinson's know, one of the symptoms that some of us experience, and I greatly experienced, are sleep problems. So I sleep poorly enough that the last thing I need is to have a device strapped to my wrist at night. And unbelievably, I didn't even notice it. So I slept with a watch for 3 or 4 nights and didn't even notice it. Slept, well, I won't say fine, but slept as I normally do. And so that was really not an issue. The pilot study, I had to wear 2 watches, and so I got a couple of comments from people saying, "Hey, what's with the 2 watches?" Which actually was just another opportunity for me to raise awareness and explain what I was doing and talk about Parkinson's. So I didn't mind that at all. And then the phone itself, I think it wasn't that big a deal. I generally have a phone anyway, and so I for the pilot I had to have an extra phone. I know that they're working on making that as least cumbersome as possible and making it as sort of invisible as they can. So overall, the experience was really pretty favorable for me.
And what actually do you know yet? Sort of what was being measured? I mean, were they looking at something specific with you? Were they collecting basic things like what was happening with a tremor or arm swing? How much did you, I guess, know about what was being monitored? And have you gotten any insight yet as to what was learned?
So as we talked about, I mean, they collect an amazing amount of data every second. So I do know that the devices had these accelerometers and all sorts of other tools which would measure my tremor. I have a tremor in my right side, and I have stiffness in my right side. So the devices, I believe, were able to measure when there was the movement that would look like a tremor, when my gait was slow or sluggish, which would look like stiffness and rigidity. And what was really interesting to me is I'm a horribly non-compliant patient when it comes to keeping a diary. So I was diagnosed about 7 years ago, and I've never really kept a diary. I've never been good about that. But I did for the study, and what was interesting to me was that when I went and looked at the diary I kept, I could see patterns of when my medication was wearing off, and when did I sense symptoms that lined up with when I took medication. And so the idea is that by combining my own personal observations of the data that I collected in the diary, and then matching up against when did the devices show that I was on or off, or at least show tremor or stiffness, they can probably do a much better job than they can just by asking me questions. And as we talked about earlier in the call, I mean, those appointments that you go to and they get these questions, they're very subjective. It's often hard for me to remember, what I was experiencing or when the symptoms are happening. And this was an objective way to match up what I thought I was experiencing with what they could observe through the data and the technology.
We just got a question. We're going to start taking, by the way, participants in our webinar today, all of your questions. So do keep them coming in. I'm seeing lots of good ones already on the screen. But one person just emailed in a question, Brett, that I think I should raise right away to you, which was from Andrinu, who said, why were two watches necessary? So why were two watches necessary?
Well, I'll give my best shot at the answer, and others may have a better answer, which was one watch was connected to the phone so that it would upload certain data on a streaming basis. And in fact, there was one moment during the study where they noticed that my power on the phone was dropping down and they weren't going to get as good an upload. And they actually called me and said, "Hey, we noticed that your phone is losing power. Can you replug it in?" And it was fine. So one watch was connected to the phone and would send the data up. The other watch just stored the data in the watch, and at the end of the couple of days, I turned all the equipment in, but that watch, they would then connect to a computer, and I believe that they were sort of comparing the data in the two watches to see if what was uploaded was the same as what the watch that gathered the data right there, whether it matched up. And I also think it had different accelerometers and perhaps could match. Check different sides. Someone else may have a better answer for that.
Yeah, this is Bill. I can comment on that because it brings up something that I wanted to mention, which is these early studies really are pilot studies. We're using off-the-shelf devices. One question people ask is Fox and Intel developing a specific wearable device? And the answer is no. We're developing a platform that should be able to interact and work with a whole variety of wearable devices, either present now or in the future, and to extract the data, analyze it. So that's the important thing to know, is this is really a platform for now and in the future, and is not linked to a specific device. So therefore, we're using several currently available off-the-shelf devices, and the reason we used two was for redundancy. We wanted to make sure not only, since the watches were slightly different, to try to analyze the kind of the best fit for Parkinson's measurements, but also just to have some redundancy. So what we're doing in these studies is, in fact, as you said, much more cumbersome than what we envision for the future, but it's sort of a necessary first step to look at this in a very rigorous fashion.
Let me raise one other question, and then we'll push on and start getting to all of our participant questions. But, Brett, you said something else which was intriguing, that when one of your watches started getting low on power, you got a call saying, "Hey, buddy, you better plug in or get more power," which, of course, raises interesting questions, I think, about privacy, and that they knew that your watch was low, and so that means Brett's being monitored. And so, not only as an attorney, but someone who I know is concerned about questions of privacy generally, I'm curious about your response to that, Brett, about whether you had any worries about that. And then Bill and Lilly, chime in on that too, because this is probably something that's been in the news some recently about whole questions of data and privacy. So I think it'd be worth going around once on that question. First, though, your own feeling about that, Brett.
Yeah, Dave, that's a great and very important question, because I was worried about privacy. I think everybody is, especially when it relates to personal information, medical data, even data that shows, where are you, and are you active, are you sleeping, are you are you, anything that could track you raises automatic privacy concerns. So I think the first thing to point out is that this was a pilot study, so I wouldn't anticipate that in the other parts of the study you would necessarily have the same kind of monitoring and sort of watching over what you're doing and when you're doing it. So, the actual study may be a little different. Second of all, they warned me. I knew what I was getting into. So they told me that someone would be monitoring this, that if the power dropped down or something went wrong, they lost connectivity, that they would reach out to me. And it was the same person. It was someone who I had met and spoke to. And so I knew what I was signing up for and did it with my eyes open. As for the rest of it, I am very comfortable that the data that they collect is going to be anonymized. That they're looking to not track a particular single person, but the sort of collection of data that to help research and to help patients. And between the sort of the good practices of the Fox Foundation and Intel and the privacy laws that are out there, I'm relatively comfortable that my privacy wasn't at risk. And but it's definitely worth asking and worth being clear about.
Lilly, you want to add anything from the Foundation's point of view about privacy concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what Brett said is correct. I think he was participating in the first of what will be many probably pilot studies to help advance this technology to the point where it's ready to be available at a mass scale. And so in these pilot studies, there's a certain focus on assessing the feasibility of using technology like this on a wider scale, and also optimizing the experience so that when we do go wider and many more people are able to participate in this way, that things like battery life and charging at certain times and the level of power and how to put the watch on and make sure it's continuing to stream data, all of that has been optimized by what we've learned in the clinical studies. So the level of monitoring is certainly much more intense, I would say, than at a point where these studies are available, or these devices are available for this use outside of a clinical setting. And you can understand that for the purposes of the study, the monitoring was happening more so to understand what types of challenges participants would face, how often they would need to charge, and also help to inform the sets of kind of FAQs and level of customer support that would be needed at a later date on a larger scale. And then secondly, what Brett mentioned about the sort of data protection piece of this is accurate, that all of the data is encrypted both at the transmission level, so from the device to the cloud where the data is stored, and then again the cloud data is again encrypted and protected when Intel is using this de-identified information for the development of their algorithm. So main point being that the level of monitoring that's happening in these current studies is much more extensive than what would happen outside of a clinical study.
Let's summarize kind of where we are, and then we're going to start taking all of your questions. So we've been hearing that Intel and Fox are developing techniques to interpret all of this data so that it can be turned into digestible information. Bill Marks was making the important point that this is all about a platform, really. And Bill, it's platform agnostic, right? The goal is to create something that any device practically can be used to collect this. It's not designed to be specific for a particular wearable application, correct?
That's exactly right. And, it may be that in the future certain devices are better than others, but that's exactly right. That is the philosophy, to provide access to the community to a broad spectrum of options for monitoring.
And then we're going to be going forward from here to be using these devices to capture that much more data in future studies. So let's get to all of your questions. We'll come back and summarize a couple of more points as we go forward. This first question from Jack. So what's the next step? Is there an estimated timeline for the release of an app or for something that consumers can actually use? Lilly, walk us through where we're at with the timeline.
Sure. So as we mentioned, the first feasibility study to understand how the devices are used by participants was with 40 individuals, 30 patients, and 10 controls, and that data is now being processed and analyzed. In the meantime, we are in the process of launching 2 studies in parallel. A follow-on study which is designed to understand the impact of the wearing off cycle on patients. So similar to the way that in the first study patients were asked to wear the device in a clinical setting and perform the UPDRS assessment in a clinical setting so that the clinician could correlate the objective data to what's actually happening and observed in person in a clinic setting. And then they'll go home for 3 days and wear the devices and feed all of the subjective data back for analysis. The second study looks at not only a patient performing this in a clinic setting on medication, but a patient performing this where the medication is actually given in a clinic setting so that over a period of time the UPDRS is completed every 30 minutes and the clinician is able to observe sort of how motor activity changes as medication kicks in and wears off. So both of these studies are important in helping to kind of correlate, as we said, a lot of the objective accelerometer data with actual Parkinson's motor symptoms, which is, I think, at this moment really key to this technology going any further in Parkinson's. In parallel, we're also launching a study to understand the ability or the feasibility of mailing these devices out to individuals in their home without actually introducing them formally to the process in a clinic setting and providing them with an instruction manual. So we're trying to understand right now, better understand and correlate the objective data to actual motor symptoms that can be observed and also understand how to really specifically inform somebody how to use this and do it on their own in a user-friendly way where the clinic piece of this is no longer necessary. So, I think it's impossible to tell when this technology will be available to kind of a larger scale audience, but you can see that we're doing it iteratively, and with every step in the trial process, we get closer to probably uncovering even more questions. But the idea is that each step gets us closer to being able to make this available to a larger audience down the road.
I think what I'm sensing, Bill Marks, in the questions that I'm seeing on the screen is there's great eagerness in this. Barbara says, if I'm already using my tracker, can I participate? Marcia says, if I get one, will it be waterproof? I mean, people are ready to jump in, sort of literally, I think. So, which is great, but sort of give us the bigger picture, Bill, from your point of view. People, unfortunately, right now can't just dial into a study and participate with the tracker they're already wearing. Do you have some sense of kind of how this will play out over time, when this will actually be something that Bill Marks, the clinician, can use and Marcia, the patient, can use?
Yeah, well, I believe we really have 2 parallel pathways here. There's nothing to prevent people from using these readily available activity monitors to get a better handle on their own function. They may not provide, sort of medical grade research quality information, but I don't see any reason why people can't take advantage of the existing and emerging wearable devices and work with their clinicians to optimize their function. So that's one thing. I don't think one needs to wait for a formal study. I believe, and we've all been sort of hesitant to enunciate a timeline, but I think we will see a very rapid escalation in our knowledge from the pilot data, because unlike usual pilot studies of 30 or 40 or 50 people, remember what those patients are providing is a lot of big data. And if the data scientists are able to develop reasonable algorithms or formulas for analyzing the data and pulling out the relevant signals, I think we could be ready to move into a larger scale sort of a trial, maybe with several hundred or even 1,000 patients, maybe in a year or so. And then that'll take us to a whole new step. So that iteration is a big step. And I think the goal that I've always emphasized in this project, and I know that everyone is on board with, is both to help clinical care and to accelerate research, because I think those are very intertwined and compatible goals, and I think we're going to see that happen within a year or two. And then, in parallel, we've got a lot of different manufacturers releasing new wearables. This is a hot area, and that's great for us, right? Because it means that a lot of companies are investing in the development of these devices, and as they get better and offer more features, it can only be more helpful to what we're all doing here.
Brett Parker, I'm interested in your reaction to what Bill was saying, that there's really nothing to stop people from kind of using these right now to begin to get a sort of keener sense of what's going on with their particular condition. Because it sounded like for you, just the act of doing this, kind of wearing the two watches, keeping in addition a diary, made you that much more kind of tuned in to what was going on with the condition. Deborah writes saying, I'm really not sure right now how all of this is going to affect my sleep and exercise and various kinds of activities, how the disease will impact these. Can these devices help me get a better understanding? I think she's asking about what's going on with my sleep and exercise. Did you kind of find that this, in a way, even if you weren't getting the actual data, that just this participation, just wearing the device, keeping the journal, made you more aware of what was going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and in fact, as I said, I've never really kept a journal or tracked a lot of this very concretely, and part of that is my sort of life philosophy is trying not to make my Parkinson's, control me and rule my life. So part of me says, the less I think about it, the better. But the fact is, by having a diary and then wearing the watches for those just for a couple of days, it did make me a little bit more keenly aware of, as I said earlier, when is my medication working or not working? When should I be taking medication or not taking medication? The sleep is fascinating because, as I said, I've always had sleep issues since diagnosis, probably before diagnosis. The one piece of data that the researcher at my site is going to give me is my sleep data, because I'm very curious to know from an objective point of view on each of those nights when was I moving around or not moving around? What kind of sleep does it look like I'm having? To the point that Dr. Marks was making about whether you should use another device now, even while we're waiting for more formal ones. The one device that I have seen before is, I know there's devices out there for sleep, for tracking sleep. There's all sorts of stuff out there, and I don't see a downside to getting a little more information about your symptoms and the disease, and it may help you to understand better sleeping patterns. Maybe you'll realize I shouldn't watch TV before I go to sleep. Maybe I should read and stay away from things like that. So I think there's a lot that can be gained.
Brett Parker, who is one of the participants in the pilot study, also a member of the Michael J. Fox Foundation's Patient Council, joining us along with Bill Marks, Professor of Neurology at UCSF and an advisor on this project to both Intel and Fox, and Lilly Cappelletti, the Associate Director for Research Partnerships at the Foundation. Bill Marks, a question from Eduardo. Can this approach be used to find the relative merits of various exercise programs that might slow down disease progression? Great question. There's always this, everyone knows exercise is good for you, sort of a continuing debate over what kind of exercise might be best. I saw something out this morning, a study from the University of Cincinnati about exercise and Parkinson's. Is this the kind of thing that might be able to generate more useful, precise data about specific kinds of exercise?
Sure, I think so, because one, the devices could actually quantitate and objectify the degree and amount and type of exercise that actually took place to try to establish sort of a dose-response curve, if you will. And then secondly, just as with any therapeutic intervention, to look at parameters of the disease itself. So exercise is simply the intervention, just like it would be a drug or deep brain stimulation or any number of therapies, and then the output is simply whatever functional abilities the device is measuring. I also think, I was just thinking back to that last question, let's face it, exercise is good for all of us. It's certainly good for Parkinson's. And just wearing these devices, I think, makes us more likely to do those 10,000 steps every day. So, again, having something that's going to kind of keep this top of mind and sort of reinforce and encourage activity and exercise can only be a good thing.
here's a question about whether or not there's going to be something relatively soon that can give your doctor useful information. You were saying, Bill, there's no reason why you can't wear something now to track, exercise, steps you take, maybe how you're sleeping, as Brett was suggesting. But is there really anything that you would be able to wear that would tell you, gee, my tremor is worse at a particular time of day, that you could tell your doctor? We're not quite there yet, right?
I think that's right. I think what we don't know is the relevance of the measures of the presently available devices to Parkinson's, and so my mention of just using these off-the-shelf commercial devices is really for sort of a patient's own monitoring, and might bring forward some useful insights to their clinician. But I don't think we can draw rigorous conclusions yet, and that's the whole purpose, of course, for the research that is going on. Is let's determine exactly what measures are relevant to Parkinson's disease, and that is definitely a goal of this project. It is to establish a platform not only for data acquisition and analysis, but for reporting back. And we've all been clear in this project that we want data to be presented back to the patient to inform them in a way that's useful, data that could go back to the clinician to inform clinical management, and data that could go back to the researcher. And it's not just data, but really reporting on the data, the analytics, the portrayal of the data in a useful way. And it will probably be a bit different for those audiences. And that reminded me, when we were talking about the monitoring function and, sort of calling the phone and saying, hey, you've got to charge your device. The sort of upside to the monitoring capabilities, you could imagine for clinical purposes that a clinical center could really monitor a large number of patients clinically and really help them take better care of themselves. So I think this monitoring capability, this feedback, is going to be very useful, and definitely the strategy for this project, this platform, this collaboration, is to take the analytics and turn it around in a way that is useful, because just having a bunch of data or a bunch of algorithms isn't going to be that helpful. And just doing research-oriented analysis, I don't think, extracts the full value of the capability here.
Lilly Cappelletti, a couple questions on the data. Who has access to the data? So still some privacy concerns. Can you comment specifically on that, in the pilot study, for example, the Brett Parker data? Who has access to that? Does Brett get it? Does a clinician get it? Does just the research team, or because it's a pilot study, nobody gets it? Who gets the data?
Great question. So starting with the example that Brett gave, access to the data is centrally managed at the research site where Brett was participating, which I believe was Mount Sinai. So the investigator who is conducting the study at that site would have access to Brett's data. It will also be de-identified, and the anonymized data will be made available to Intel. Intel cannot accept any of the personally identifiable information in this piece, so they'll be able to see all the raw accelerometer data, as well as get access to the clinical data minus the identifiable information, so that they can make those correlations. Eventually, the idea is that, as Bill is talking about the platform that we're developing, our ultimate goal is to make all of this de-identified and anonymous data accessible to the larger research community through an application process similar to what the Foundation does with our Parkinson Progression Markers Initiative study, where any investigator who's interested in conducting research using the data that we're collecting is able to apply to the Fox Foundation for access. Our approach here is really more minds, more discovery, accelerates progress. But
de-identified, so it would be data that it doesn't have Brett Parker's name attached to it.
Exactly. Any pieces of the data that could be used in any way potentially to draw a line back to Brett would be removed from the data before going outside of that clinical site.
And this is Bill, just to point out that process is identical to any kind of clinical research process. This is how we handle all sorts of data, not just that collected by a sensor.
So for everyone participating who really wants to know Brett Parker's sleeping patterns, too bad you're not going to learn.
And Dave, it's Brett. I should just to chime in. That's not just a policy thing or a theoretical thing. In fact, I was talking to one of the Intel people the day of the announcement of the pilot, and in fact, they wanted to have a conversation with me about additional feedback, and they said, oh yeah, and by the way, we can't even get your data if we want it. So it's a real life protection that's in place.
A couple of questions, Bill Marks, on who can use these eventually, and I think these have to do with whether or not there could be any concerns. Joy writes, are there any concerns about electromagnetic radiation from any of these devices? And a sort of related interesting question from Eduardo about whether or not a DBS patient could use these. I assume probably getting at whether or not these devices might interfere with the wiring that is used in a DBS procedure. Can you comment on either of those issues?
Sure. There's certainly no incompatibility or problem wearing these types of devices with deep brain stimulation systems. In fact, DBS systems are quite compatible with virtually all devices in our environment. There are just a few very specific contraindications for specific medical therapeutic interactions. But and in fact, one could imagine that just as the data from these wearables helps to adjust medication, one could also imagine it would help clinicians to better adjust their DBS systems. So rather than being an incompatibility issue, I think it actually, one could imagine it being a compatibility and a benefit. So I mean, these devices, evolve, but they're in widespread use, and I'm not aware of any, adverse effects from them.
We're getting a number of questions on the ability of wrist monitors to capture non-motor or lower extremity data. I'm not quite sure what lower extremity data might be, but on the non-motor question, Bill Marks again, this is actually a really useful, important point. We touched on it a bit earlier, but as we all know, Parkinson's, well, you normally think about it as being a movement disorder. Of course, there are many other issues. Brett talked about sleep. There are also various other problems that people can have, from sexual dysfunction to constipation to problems of mood to, of course, depression, as we've learned about so recently with the Robin Williams story. So, are any of these devices at this point able to capture data that goes beyond beyond motor issues to the many other things that people with Parkinson's contend with?
They are. I mean, let's acknowledge that the present devices, while reasonably sophisticated, are still in their early stages. But as I think Lilly said, they can monitor heart rate, and some of them monitor perspiration. And by triangulating between vital signs and movement, one can infer sleep stages and things like that. My expectation is those non-motor monitoring capabilities will become much more robust in the near future. And for me, this is one of the very exciting aspects of this approach. We can test movement pretty well in the clinic. This, as we said, will test it better, more reliably, and more continuously. But we really don't have such great ways to monitor the non-motor functions or their response to therapeutic interventions. So for me, this is a really powerful part of what the future of these wearables, I think, will bring to us. And that is a more complete picture of function, of quality of life, of symptomatology, so that that we can really focus on the whole person. And so I do think that is an extremely powerful potential for this approach.
Just a question, basic one, Lilly, that's but important reminder. Marcia writes, is cell service necessary in order to participate? My assumption is it would be.
Actually, for the studies we're using this in currently, it's all reliant on Wi-Fi to be able to connect through a Bluetooth device, the smartwatch to the phone to transmit to the cloud. In the long run, I think when we scale this out on a massive level, certainly the devices will be relying on Wi-Fi, and I I don't believe that at this time they're using cell service to do this.
Well, and I was just going to point out, this is Bill, that there are really two approaches. One is if you need to stream and collect data in real time or near real time, either for research purposes or to monitor a patient, then some sort of connectivity like that might be necessary. But the other approach would be a device that has its own internal memory that's sufficient to capture the data or epochs of data and store it and not require any kind of real-time Wi-Fi or cellular technology. So, both approaches will probably be used.
Let's just review sort of what we know and what we still need to know about this as we begin to wrap up our conversation. Bill marks on this first point that we see on the screen that it can really help patients monitor their own disease and work with their physicians to optimize care. Again, we're not quite there yet. We have to figure out these formulas that will make the data digestible. But it seems that this objective data can give both patients more power to monitor their own condition, but can also help people like you, because after all, right now, you're also limited by the powers of your own clinical expertise and your own perceptions to be able to see how someone's finger tapping translates into perhaps a treatment. It's an objective kind of monitor for you as well. So summarize, if you would, sort of in the everyday practice, how useful this can be, both for patient, but also for Bill Marks, clinician.
Yeah, I think this is extremely important because in order for Parkinson's patients to have access to specialists, there are a limited number of them, and to be able to convey relevant clinical information, functional information to the clinician that is so useful to them that they can make decisions and recommendations about management, I think it opens up a whole new world for the individual patient and for managing populations of patients. So you could imagine rural patients, remote patients, having access to top-notch centers and not needing to have to drive into New York City or San Francisco, that there could be remote management, monitoring, and capabilities set up. And so I'm excited about this, not only sort of with the conventional model that the patient walks in the door to my clinic, we sit down and we look at their analysis or the report, but I'm excited that I could potentially take care of thousands or tens of thousands of patients, a huge population of patients scattered all over the country or the world, and be useful to them. And so I think this is extremely exciting.
And it's worth remembering that right now only about a fourth of all Parkinson's patients are able to see a movement disorder specialist, someone who has specific training in movement disorders. So it does open up the possibility of getting better care to people who don't have access to that kind of specialist. And from the Foundation's perspective in terms of moving research forward, Lilly Cappelletti, on that second point about how this may speed the ability to get results quicker on the testing of new treatment options, how optimistic are you that this can be really transformative in terms of advancing where we go?
We're very optimistic, and I think that's evident from the level of investment and amount of attention that we're giving to kind of really solidifying and better understanding these objective measures and how they relate to Parkinson's symptoms. But I think, it's important to harness and leverage the technology that's out there and help us to advance from what we know is a rather antiquated way of looking at symptoms and disease management.
And Brett Parker, last word is yours from a patient perspective. We've heard about the kind of difference this can make. So I'd like to let you kind of conclude our webinar by speaking from a patient point of view about whether this allows you, and already through this pilot experience, to feel both more empowered in terms of how you're able to monitor the condition, but whether it also makes you more optimistic about where we're moving in this field as we go forward.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, on both fronts. I mean, I do feel the whole experience has made me more empowered, more sort of in touch with my disease, not in a way that makes it constantly on my mind, but in a very sort of thoughtful way of my symptoms and my medication, how they interact, and what I can do to sort of take care of myself. And we often feel sort of frustrated as patients that there's not much we can do. We participate in Fox Trial Finder, and we see our doctors, and we do what we can. But this is a way to have some active role in advancing the research. And frankly, it's amazing that it's taken this long for technology to be used in this context. We use technology in all sorts of ways in our daily life for entertainment and fun, and that's great. But to see it used in a very productive way gives me a lot of optimism. So it's very exciting.
With that, I want to thank both Brett Parker, along with Lilly Cappelletti and Dr. Bill Marks for their participation in our webinar today. We've reached the end of our time. You can always find out more about how to participate in research and learn about future studies that will involve wearable technologies by going to foxtrialfinder.org. You'll also be able to listen to and watch previous webinars at that same website, michaeljfox.org/webinars. Thanks again to our panelists and to all of you for participating, and join us again on the third Thursday in September when we will have another webinar for you. I'm Dave Iverson. Thanks again for your participation.